Okay. Continuing on our series of Piskei Halacha and Minagim, I wanted to discuss tonight a topic. I usually try to discuss issues that are more klali, yesodot, and we could learn different pratei halacha. So today, I thought to deviate from that and to study a particular minhag that came to my attention recently. That I am in the process of examining whether this is a minhag that has enough of a basis, enough of a source, or is it a minhag that we should say that it's not strong enough and maybe do different. And the reason why I think this is important is because it's a hemshech, it's a continuation to what we discussed from the Pri Chadash, as it's known that the Pri Chadash says whenever we have a minhag that is against a halacha, so the halacha wins. And then we discussed that each thing is ligufo shel inyan. If you're going to have the minhag enough to rely on, we follow the minhag, and if you don't, we don't follow the minhag. Tonight is going to be a perfect example where it really could go both ways, and a certain person is going to have a hachra'ah how to be noheg, and to determine what the source of this minhag was. It's interesting. We had this over the weekend. We had the honor of having the presence of Hagon Rav David Yosef Shlita here in Los Angeles. He's the author of the popular Sfarim Halacha Berura. And he came to a Hilula that we were doing in honor of Rabbi Yaakov Abu Chatzera. He came to our shul. And when I was discussing with him Minagim, he actually mentioned that his father, Hagon Rav Ovadia Yosef Zatzal, was very pro minhagim on minhagim that he felt weren't against halacha. Basically, he was saying the Pri Chadash. If the halacha was against the minhag, he would go with halacha, otherwise not. And then he emphasized, however, he basically went out against a lot of Iraqi minhagim, and he felt also there were a lot of Moroccan minhagim that are good have to be mitchazek. As he was going out, he repeated this over to me. So I asked him if I could actually record him saying this, and he said it on recording that there are many Moroccan minhagim that are very, very good, and we have to be mechazik them, and we have to continue them. And on Motzei Shabbat, I had private conversations with him where I explained to him my position regarding halal, that halal with a bracha, it could be Maran Bet Yosef himself said halal with a bracha, even in Eretz Yisrael, because in Sheilot Utshuvot Bet Yosef says he never deviates from what he did in Sfarad. You remember we spoke about that. And even though he writes that the minhag in Israel is not to say bracha on Halel, he's saying that was the minhag of Eretz Yisrael, the Misto Aravim, not the Sfaradim who came. He said he heard. He didn't say it's impossible, and he also agreed. He said that 100%. He said vehemently his father would say that any Moroccan that's in Chutz La'aretz has to make a bracha on halal. Of course, that's his minhag, and he has to be mechazik that minhag. Just Rav Ovadia felt that in Eretz Yisrael, it's the place of Maran, and therefore a person shouldn't make a bracha. On that, I told him, I told him my whole cheshbon, and he did say that he heard that if a Moroccan wants to do a bracha on halal, even in Eretz Yisrael, in other words, he didn't agree, but he wasn't vehemently opposed, we'll call it. So that was interesting that Hagon Rav David Yosef, a son of Rav Ovadia Yosef, was being mechazik the position that his father was very strong in keeping minhagim, which I always got the impression, if you read the Sfarim of Rav Ovadia Yosef, he is much more conservative in keeping the minhagim than what people make him out to be. He just felt there are certain yanim that he wanted to change, but in general that was his kavalach, and I see very much in common with Rav David Yosef more than others that represent Rav Ovadia on the way they understood it. So I think that's an important that was an important conversation and clarification. Either way, getting back to our inyan of the day, which is the following. On the hefsek aliyot of Yom Minchan Shabbat on Monday and on Thursday. Recently, Art Scroll put out a Sephardic Sidur, which I'm sure you have seen. It's a wonderful Sephardic Sidur. Here it is. And in this Sephardic Sidur, they asked me to review the Moroccan customs, which I have. And recently they've been working on corrections. So I was asked to review the different places where the Moroccan custom is to be mafsik, is to stop the aliyah and to go further. And I never really paid much attention to it. I knew that there was differences, but I never really was ma'ayin in the sugya. So this gave me an opportunity recently to be ma'ayin a little bit more in this sugya, which is actually coming up in Daf Yomi, and it'll give us a chance to understand the emphasis where the Moroccan custom was that was different than other idot. Okay, so this is why if everybody could open up to their sidurim by the Hefsek Aliyot, and really one of the main places where there's going to be a controversy is going to be Parashat Va'era, which we are in the middle of reading. We read it already Shabbat Mincha. We read it on Monday, and now we're going to read it again Be'ezat Hashem on Thursday. So in Parashat Va'era, where do you have Aliyat Levi? Where do you have Aliyat Levi? I'm sorry? The next one. How do you end off Aliyat Israel? Aliyat Levi, I'm sorry. How do you end off Aliyat Levi? Ume'avoda kasha, right? Is that where you have it? Ume'avoda kasha. What? Right. However, if you look inside the more modern Moroccan Sidurim, which is Sidur Avotenu, Rabbi Meir Atiyah, the new Tfilat HaChodesh that came out, they'll put the Hefsek in the Pasuk Morasha Ani Adonai. That's where they put the Pasuk beforehand. Now, what is the difference between these? So it's written in the Gemara Masechet Megillah, Daf Chaf Bet Amud Bet. En meshayrin pachot mishlosha psukim. Gzera mishum hayotzin. That you shouldn't stop less than 3 psukim away from the end of the parasha. Parashiot in the Torah is whenever there's a pei, it's parasha ptucha or stuma. The hefsek aliyot that we have are not hefsekim that are dictated halacha leMoshe miSinai. You could stop wherever you want, basically, as long as you follow the rules of en mishayrin pachot mishlosha psukim, gzera mishum hayotzim. And this is what's nifsak in the Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Siman Kuf Lamed Chet, that a person should always make sure never to end or never even to start with pachot mishlosha psukim. And the reason is because there's a halacha that you're not allowed to read less than 3 psukim. And what happens is that if you finish before the end of 3 psukim, so somebody who's going to come in is going to think that he's not going to notice what happened. He's going to leave early, and he's going to think that you're only going to finish the parasha, and it's only 2 psukim. It's only 1 pasuk, and because of this tremendous mar'ita ayin that Chachamim were concerned from, interesting why they were concerned. Then there's halacha that you should always end at the parasha or in the middle of the parasha where you're left over with 3. That is the halacha nifsak in the Shulchan Aruch Siman Kuf Lamed Chet. The Rama adds on something else. The Rama ends off, V'gam en mistaimim ve'en potchin bedavar ela bechitov. We don't end off, or we don't start, unless it's something good. And this, the makor of this, is the Rambam in Ilchot Tefillah, Perek Yud Gimel Halacha He. So I'm going to go through. So first of all, let's start with Parashat Va'era that I just brought up. It's a huge issue over here, because it's understood that we didn't want to end off with Velo Shamuel Moshe Mikotze Ruach U'Me'avoda Kasha, because that's not something good. Me'avoda Kasha, it's not something good. But on the other hand, what is the choice? What are you supposed to do? End up with Murasha Ani Hashem? That's ending off one pasuk before the end. And you're not allowed to do that. That's against halacha. So, L'cha'ora, this custom is against halacha, because it's finishing off one pasuk before the end. On the other hand, to finish off bidavar kashe is also not good. And the truth is, you can ask a question: what do you gain by finishing Murashani Hashem? You're still starting with something that's not good. Okay, it seems to be from here that to finish off with something not good is not as bad, is better. It's better not to finish with something good. It's better not to finish with something bad than to start with something bad. There would have been a different option, that you could keep on going up until Ele Rashi, until you end up with Eretz Mitzrayim, and then you add on extra psukim. There could have been that concept, and some sidurim say that. It doesn't seem to be that was the minhag. Maybe they were choshesh mishum tircha de tzibura. So Parashat Va'era is a very good example of an indication of what else is going to go on. I'm just going to give a few examples. That in Parashat Lech Lecha, the minhag in Morocco was to finish Aliyat Levi at the end of Pasuk Chet, which is written Vayikra B'Shem Hashem. And they don't end off with Pasuk Tet Hanegba, because the next Pasuk talks about Vayira'av Ba'aretz, and that's not Bechitov. Okay? Then another example is in I'm not going to say all the different. I just want to bring out a point. In Parashat Emor, it's written, and we end off with Pasuk Hey, Lo Yisretu Saratet, and we don't end off with Pasuk Vav, which is Vayu Kodesh, like most people do. Why? Because the next Pasuk afterwards that we start in Pasuk Zayin says, Isha Zona V'Chalala Lo Tikachu. Seems to be that we didn't want to start off with Isha Zuna V'Chalila. Nobody else was concerned about this, but it seemed to be the Moroccan minhag was to be concerned not to start off with something about Isha Zuna V'Chalila. Parashat Matot. Parashat. There's a few other examples. I might get into them a little later, but let's not get overly mixed up. Let's just keep with those three examples that I gave, which is Parashat Lech Lecha, Parashat Va'era, and Parashat Emor, where you see that there's a concept of trying as hard to start Bechitov and to end Bechitov, and even when sometimes it will conflict with the halacha of ending off one pasuk before the end, it seems to be we did it. Now, what is the mikor? There is no real mikor. If you look inside the Sidurim Tfilat HaChodesh, and you take a look at the Sidur of the Bet Oved, whoever put the Hefsekim there, it's not by Murasha Ani Hashem. It's not by Murasha Ani Hashem. Rav Meir Atiyah, in his Sidur Avotenu, writes that that's where somebody should stop. And it seems to be that the new Sefer Tfilat HaChodesh, what they told me was that an old Bal Koref that lives right now in Kiryat Sefer told him that as well. I also researched recently from one of the old Chazanim, his name is Rav Chaim Biton, from Eretz Yisrael? Apparently he says yes, that's what they used to do. They always used to end off by Morasha Ani Hashem. It was Yadua that many people did that. The question is, once again, it flies against the explicit halacha. It's not written in the Tfilat HaChodeshim. It's not written in the Bet Toved. It's not written in any halacha sfarim to do that way. So, and the other places also where I mentioned, even though it's lav dafka noged halacha, but who says Isha Zuna v'chalala is a davar lo tov? Who says that in Parashat Lech Lecha Vayirav Ba'aretz is so bad. So let's discuss a little bit this halacha of Le'atchil b'chitov v'lesayem b'chitov. It's written in the Darkei Moshe in the name of the Or Zarua. He starts with this Bechor. Kol, and it's written over there, it's Siman Membed, but it's a mistake, it's Siman Memtet. That Kol HaKoreh b'Torah yiftach b'davar tov v'yisayem b'davar tov. The Rambam writes this as well. The Rambam writes in Perek Yud Gimel, Hilchot Tfilah Halacha, based on Yerushalmi, Masechet Megillah, that in the parasha of the Tochechot, you should always try not to start with the or end with the Tochechot. And the Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Tav Chav Chet that the way to do it is that you start a pasuk before and you end the pasuk later. But you shouldn't start or end with the Tochechot because of this inyan of L'Sayem B'chitov, and that seems to be a legitimate inyan. The Rambam also writes in Parashat Ha'azinu, you usually should always start and then B'chitov. Besides Parashat Ha'azinu, says the Rambam, because Kulo Divrei Musar V'tochecha, since it's rebuke, that we allow you, but otherwise really you shouldn't. So this inyan seems to be codified in halacha. The question is, when does it apply? When does it not apply? The Mishnayot in Masechet Yadayim, talk about a tzduki that complains to the Prushim. He says the Prushim were Chazal, the tzdukim were those who were kofir in the Torah Shebal Peh. And they write, how do you have the audacity Shatem kodvim et Moshel im Moshe baget? You write Hashem's name together with Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. And the Prushim say, what are you talking about, tzdukim? You write the Moshel with Paro. So, in other words, the way that they write the Moshel's name, or they write Paro's name with Hashem's name, so they answer them back. In other words, the Prushim got the last word. So the Rambam writes in Perush HaMishnayot, V'lefi shezachar pasuk. Oh, and after they answer the tzdukim about Paro, the Mishnah ends off, and the Masechta ends off this way. V'keshelaka, and you should know, when Paro got his tircha, his svak, Mahu Omer, Hashem HaTzadik. He says Hashem HaZat Tzadik. Says the Rambam, why do we end off when Paro got his svak, he ends off Hashem HaTzadik? It's not relevant to what was said before. It says the Rambam in Perush HaMishnayot, because it is not fortunate, Eno Me'ushar, Shiachtom Masechta Mino HaMasechtot Be'akhashat HaKofer Lekvura, that we should be Makhesh Paro, that we should end off with Paro being Makhesh Am Yisrael. And that's why we end off Hashem HaTzadik. Says the Rambam, you should end off a Masechta in the proper way. In Masechet Ketubot also, it says Atidin, Kol Ilane, etc. Ashvach on Eretz Yisrael. Why? Says Tosfot in the last Tosfot in Masechet in Ketubot. Lefi shirotze lesayem bedavar tov nakat la'acha v'lo kamra le'el da'ayri b'animili. Even though we weren't discussing this inyan, but in order to end off with something good, we end off the Masechta. So you have Tosfot and the Pirush Mishnah and the Rambam say also by Masechtot you have this inyan ledavar tov. However, the Ben Ish Chai asks a question in Rav Pe'alim, Chelek Daled, Siman Membet. He asks the following: why is it that there are some parashiot that end off with something bad? Like at the end of Parashat Bamidbar, it's written, Velo yavu liraot ki bela el hakodesh. In the end of Lech Lecha, it's written, Vayamot terach bet Charan. In Vayikra, it's written, V'leish asher yishkav im teme'ah. How could that be? You're supposed to end off b'chitov. Now it's the Ben Ish Chai's question in Rav Pe'alim. So the Ben Ish Chai answers the following answer. Rabotai, listen. Nire liyashiv ha'inyan. Dekiven de'achar siyum ha'parasha mevarech ha'olah birkot ha'torah ketekanat Chazal, יוחיוב על אדם, לא חשיב סיום. אפילו שהחזן קורא והעולם מברך, כי צריך להטות אוזניו ולברכה, לענות אמן, שומע דינו כקורא. So since he ends off with saying ברכת התורה anyways, and the shomea has to listen, and it's considered like he's reading, so he's finishing off with Birkat HaTorah, so it's not a problem. And the one who is reading listens to the bracha, it's as if he's ending off with something good as well. That's the Ben Ish Chai's word. Rabotai, lo zachiti le'avin bichlal divrei Ben Ish Chai. I have no idea what he's saying. Hare, the Rama is writing explicitly this inyan, Yisayem bechitov, v'yatchil bechitov, and that's talking about somebody who's oleh la Torah, and he's doing Birkot HaTorah. How in the world is the Ben Ish Chai saying that this inyan of Yisayem v'yatchil bechitov doesn't apply when you're being an oleh la Torah because you do Birkat HaTorah before or after? Ribono de al-makula, the Ramah is saying this halacha, and the Ramah is talking about exactly by aliyot, where you're making a bracha before and after. Therefore, divrei Ben Ish Chai kavanat kodsho ne'elma mimeni. I don't understand it. However, I have another answer. The Ben Ish Chai has a question. How could it be in all of these parashiot they end off with something that is apparently negative? Right? So I think that the pshat is like this. If you take a look in the end of Megillat Echa, it ends off on a bad note. You got upset at us. But what's the minhag, the universal minhag, not only by Moroccans, is that we add on a pasuk, or by Shiri Hashirim, every week. What's the last pasuk? And how do we end off? We add on the pasuk. Why do we add on that pasuk? It's in order not to end off bechitov. Bechira, it's to end off bechitov. Ask you Akasha. The Torah is not concerned with that. Why is Megillat Echa, it ends off on a bad note? Why does Shir Hashirim end off on a bad note and we have to add on the pasuk? The answer is that for the parasha itself to end off on a bad note, me'avodah kasha, or by Shir Hashirim, or by Echa, that's the kavanat HaTorah. The kavanat HaTorah there's reasons why every single word in the pasuk goes in a certain place, and these are sodot elyonim, why they end off with these, why they start that way. That's not going to trump le'olam yisayem o yatchil bechitov. But a gavra, when he's reading, he should always try to start before or afterwards. These are halachot in regards to learning and reading when it's basar v'dam are in control. Not by Chavdalit Sifrei Tanakh that are written Beruach HaKodesh, and they have reasons to every single seder of the pasuk. So when we are reading, where by us we could always start good, we could always end off a little good, we could always, always a Masechta when we're writing a Masechta, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh, we can end off good. Then we try as much as we can to play around with it, because it's not Sodot Elyonim. However, we're not going to, dictate why the Torah is written or not. That's not going to trump that halacha. I think that's a davar pashut. Now, getting back to all of these different hifsikim that in Morocco they did. So I don't think that I think they weren't makabel the dvarim with the Ben Ish Chai that since you're being oleh la Torah, there's no chashash, because that's against the Rama. Also the Rambam, he writes mefurash ha'oleh la Torah yisayem v'yatchil b'chitov. He's also talking about Pashtus Birkat Torah. He's not mechalek that they did Birkat Torah. He's not talking about a time where they only made a bracha at the beginning, at the end, bracha at the end. Furthermore, the Chida writes in Yosef Ometz, Siman Mem Zayin, that he thinks that there's no real inyan if somebody is doing Birkat Torah and the Chazan is reading. It's only an inyan if somebody is Oleh la Torah, he starts or not. According to the Chida, you'll have less of a problem, but it's not mashma that anybody was mechalik this way. In other words, the Chida wants to say that if it's the Oleh is different than the Koreh, then there's no chashash. I don't know where there's a bet after this svara. I don't know where it's mukhrach. But the Rama says that it's shayach, whether you're not the Oleh is the Koreh, whether it's not the Koreh. So we're coming back to our original question. Why in Morocco they were choshesh for this? And why weren't other places choshesh? For example, Parashat Emor, we don't want to start off with Isha Zona V'Chalala. Or Parashat Lech Lecha, we don't want to start off with Vayira Ba'aretz. Parashat Ve'era, up to a point where we'll be okay to the halacha of 3 psukim before the end, which we'll get to in a moment. So regarding Lisayem or Yatchil Bechitov, I just want to mention a point that I think is important. I have a friend, he lives here in Los Angeles. He grew up in Morocco. He comes to Shiurim sometimes over here. Whenever he asks me a question about like something to do with the bathroom or something, he says, "Chutz min hakavod, chutz mikvodchem." Like in America, we have a problem with saying the word bathroom. In Morocco, it wasn't polite. As a matter of fact, I found a shtar written regarding Michirat Behema. And it's written over there, Michirat Behema, Chutz min hakavod, Choma. Rashi Tevot Choma, Chutz min hakavod. In other words, I'm sorry for the language I'm using. Very careful on Lashon Nikiyah. Like the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim says, Le'olam yakdim bedavar tov, which is the first 2 dapim of Pesachim. Why does it say or le'arbasar? Because it's better to say or than choshech. Choshech is written in the Torah. Doesn't matter. We try to speak as appropriate as we can in a Lashon, even if it's a Saginahor, we try to speak in a language that's good. They're very makbid on this in Morocco. They always start with something good. So even Isha Zona V'Chalala, which by us, there's nothing wrong with, but why start with something with that type of connotation? Of course it's Torah. Of course it's written in Torah. But you don't start off with that. Chutz min hakavod. Also, Behema is written in the Torah. It's not something proper. So they were uber sensitive to that. So that's why Parashat Lech Lecha, Parashat Emor. And while I'm at it, I'll mention to you other places where they were makbid to start off with something nice. In Parashat Matot, we were careful not to end with Kihini Avia Ota. Father was mafir her neder. What's wrong with that? It's better to end off with the pasuk Hashem Yishlach La. Hashem Yishlach La. That's a positive note. In Parashat Kitavo, we end off with pasuk Tet Zayin Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. Even though some end off with another pasuk, we end. Why? Because it's a nice thing. Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, the Shvach of Eretz Yisrael. Parashat Vayakel, Kol Asher Tziva Hashem. There's also a big ma'ala that, like the Bet HaLevi says, that was the whole kapara of the Egel, was that when we rebuilt the Mishkan, it was Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. So that was a nice inyan to end off that way. The real question is going to be Parashat Va'era, because you're going to have a stira in the halachot. So, there are yishuvim that you could say. There's an important Magen Avraham in Siman Kuf Lamed Chet, based on the Tosfot in Masechet Megillah, that there are some parashiot that we do start before the end of the perek, like Parashat Vayichal. And why is it that Parashat Vayichal are we not makbid? So Tosfot answers because it's mefursam lakol. So you could answer, since over here it's mefursam lakol. Everybody knows already that the parasha, that's where we usually stop, and everybody knows that's where the hefsek is. We're not so choshesh. I mean, fine, but that means you're basically left with no siman kuf lamed chet. Everybody knows where everything ends. So a little bit, it may be me'avodah kasha. Everybody knows that's where it ends. You could say like the chida. I'm sorry. You could say that it's a davar yadua, but there's no real strong mikor to that. So since there's no real strong mikor, you have a question. What's more important? Le'atchil v'lesayem b'chitov or lo lesayem b'pasuk lifdat chala? Seems to be some started this minhag that it's more important to say b'chitov. And if this was a minhag miyusad, you'd be able to find answers. But it's not such a minhag miyusad. I mean, you see that Tfilat HaChodesh doesn't write it. You see that the Betoveh doesn't write it. So my netiya is to say we shouldn't do it. Murashan Ishem. I don't have the courage yet. I still have to think about it. But it's a valid argument to be able to say that this is not a strong enough minhag. It's a valid argument to say that this is not a strong enough minhag. In the other places, we should be makbid, always atchil l'sayem b'chitov, because you're able to do it in a way that you're not violating any halacha. But by Murasha Ani Hashem, you're flying in the face of a halacha. And it's not so meyused. No poskim wrote to do that way. You have so maybe some people that started it were afraid about what was going on. Maybe not. But you see that Tfilat HaChodesh doesn't write it. And there's a way out of it also. If you continue and you do a little bit more, you'll get out of it, even though it might be a tircha de tzibura. So that's why it's not a pashira inyan. I'm navoch. I'm not sure what goes before what. I will tell you there's a machloket, and this will end off between the chida. I'm sorry, not the chida. Between the Torah Lishma, which is attributed to the Ben Ish Chai Siman Shinayin Vav, that he asks, what's better? Is it better to start b'chitov or to end b'chitov? So he has a whole pilpul, and he brings from the Rambam in Ilchot Gitin that it's always better not to start with something negative. He says it's always better, the start is more important. But the Eshel Avram Mibuchach, Siman Kuf Lamed Chet, the Buchach Rav, who happened to be the Chavruta, he was a student of the Kedushat HaLevi, Rav Levi Yitzchak Meiberdichev. That's why he's meyashev a lot of minagim. Rav Levi Yitzchak Meiberdichev always would find the good in Yidden. So I think that's his Talmud, the Eshel Avram Mibuchach. He writes, it's more important to end off, because it's written that has signon le'atchil b'gnut v'lesayim b'shvach. The mahalach is always to start with gnut v'lesayim b'shvach. So it's more important to be mesayim b'shvach. And the truth is, if you take it back to Parashat Va'era, we had a question. You're ending off with Murashan Yashem, but you're starting off with Me'avodah Kasha. So according to Eshel Avram Mibuchach, it's better, you didn't have a choice, it's better to end off with something good and not to start with something bad than to not start with something bad. But according to the Ben Ish Chai, you're not supposed to start with something bad. Unless you say that since Me'avodah Kasha is at the end of the pasuk, you're starting off with something okay. Vaydaber Moshe ken el bnei Yisrael. I don't know if you could say that that's the answer. Either way, to be masakim what we said, Parashat Va'era Tzarech Iyun. Why is it that some people end off with Murashan Yashem? It's against the Halakha and Shulchan Aruch, and there are ways to be miyashev, but we are unsure if that's strong enough of a minhag to be makayim or not. And in regard to the whole inyan of the other hefsek aliyot, it seems to be in Morocco, they were very sensitive to the inyan of le'atchil b'chitov, l'sei b'chitov, and they expanded the meaning of b'chitov, like the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim, anything remotely good. And I'll give you two more examples. That when by the Shaliach Tzibur, when he bows, he says Hamachzir Shechinato L'Tzion. Really, according to Digduk, it should be Hamachazir Shechinato L'Tzion. But the Shaliach Tzibur would say Hamachzir. And Rav Moshe Nahon in the Kuntras in the back of Sefer Magen Avot Or Chaim says the reason why he did this is because it wouldn't be proper for Sheikh Sibur to say the word chazir, hamachazir. So he would say hamachzir. And also by yiru enenu, the right nusach is to say hamolech bichvodo el chai vekayam. Somebody asked me recently, I don't know if it was over here, hamolech bichvodo. But we say hamelech bichvodo. Why? Because molech is referring to Hashem avodah zarah. We don't want to do that. So all these little different type of kneches that you see over and over. This concept of extra sensitivity to the words that came out. Okay? Chazaku baruch rabotai.